You know, when we think of a revolution, we usually picture armies and battles, right? But what if I told you one of the most profound social transformations in modern history was fought not with guns, but with poems, plays, and novels? Well, that's exactly the story we're diving into today. How Kerala, a state in southern India, completely rewrote its own social rules, all thanks to the incredible power of literature.
So how does that even happen? It's a massive question, but Kerala's history is this fascinating case study. To really understand how they pulled it off, we first have to understand the world they were so desperately trying to escape.
And this image here gives us a feel for that world. You see the symbols of a society built on ancient, rigid traditions and a strict hierarchy. This was Kerala's old order, a world that was just on the brink of a massive, massive change.
To really get the scale of this revolution, we first need to look at the chains that were holding this society down.
Okay, so you can think of this old society as being held up by four really oppressive pillars. First, you had the jinmi system, where a handful of landlords had absolute power, and the peasants doing all the work had zero ownership rights. Second, an incredibly brutal caste system that decided your entire life the moment you were born. Third, the seclusion of women, especially Namboothiri women, who were often literally confined to their kitchens. And what held it all together? A web of debilitating superstitions and temple rituals used to keep everyone in their place.
But then, things started to shift. A new wave of thinkers emerged, and they were the ones who provided the intellectual firepower, the philosophical ammunition, for what would become a revolution of the mind.
One of the most important figures in this Great Awakening, or the Kerala Renaissance, as it's often called, was Sree Narayana Guru. His goal was both simple and totally radical, to free people from the mental prison of the caste system.
And this quote, it just perfectly captures his core message. In a society that was sliced and diced into countless hierarchies, this simple idea was like an earthquake. It was a direct assault on the very foundations of the old world.
Now let's turn to another key reformer, Chattampi Swamikal. He took a different angle, but it was just as powerful. He decided to go after the historical myths that propped up the whole system. So what he did was use history as a weapon. His work basically debunked the founding myth that the land of Kerala was some divine gift to the Brahmins. He argued that, actually, other communities were the original inhabitants. This was a brilliant move because it completely undermined the religious justification for the whole caste hierarchy.
And then you had Brahmananda Sivayogi. He was known as the guru of atheists, and he went after the spiritual control that the system had over people. He argued that real spirituality had nothing to do with all these elaborate, expensive rituals that were just designed to maintain control. Instead, he said it was all about achieving ananda, a state of inner happiness, of bliss, that was available to absolutely anyone, no matter their caste.
So you've got all these powerful new ideas starting to swirl around. But how do you get those ideas to everybody? The answer was through art. This is the moment when the pen truly became a sword.
And here's just a taste of the literary explosion that fueled this whole movement. But these weren't just dusty books sitting on a shelf, you know? Poems like Pandit Karuppan's Jathikkummi, which was the very first poem to directly attack the caste system, were recited out loud at huge public gatherings. Plays like V.T. Bhattacharya's From the Kitchen to the Stage were performed live, bringing the critique of women's seclusion right to the community. O. Chandu Meno's novel Indulekha was so popular, it just sparked this huge hunger for reading. Every single one of these works was an act of rebellion.
To really see just how radical this all was, let's zoom in on one incredible example, the epic poem Duravasta by Kumaran Asan.
I mean, you have to understand, this story was just completely unthinkable at the time. A woman from the highest Brahmin caste marrying a man from a so-called untouchable community. By telling this story, Asan wasn't just questioning the rules, he was blowing them up in the most dramatic way possible, forcing everyone who heard it to confront their deepest prejudices.
This line right here, it's from another one of Asan's poems, and it is just searing. It cuts right to the heart of the issue, doesn't it? It exposes the complete biological absurdity of caste with this raw emotional power. This is what made the literature so effective. It was direct, it was passionate, and you just couldn't ignore it.
And it wasn't just fiction that was changing things. Memoirs, like V.T. Bhattacharya's Tears and Dreams, were so important because they made the struggle personal. It wasn't just some abstract political fight anymore. You were reading a first-hand account of the suffering and the dreams for change, which made it feel so much more urgent and real.
So,
As these stories and poems spread, they did more than just change individual minds. They started to build a whole new collective consciousness. And that cultural energy, well, it was bound to spill off the page and into the world of politics.
As the movement got bigger, two main strategies started to form. Some people believed in a war of position, the long-term cultural game of changing hearts and minds from the ground up. Others pushed for a war of movement, a more direct political fight to seize state power and force change from the top down. It's a classic debate, and it was happening right there in Kerala.
To really get what was at stake politically, you need to know this one term, Kudikadappukar. These were the landless laborers. They lived and worked on a landlord's property, but they were treated basically like serfs, with no rights, no security, nothing. They were the living embodiment of that old, broken Janmi system.
And here is where you see the ultimate payoff of this literary revolution. Those ideas that started in poems and novels finally made their way into the halls of power. The Agrarian Relations Bill was a direct result of this huge cultural shift. It gave land ownership to the Kudikadappukar, and in doing so, it completely dismantled that old feudal system. The pen really was mightier than the sword.
So, where does all this leave Kerala today? What's the legacy? Well, the revolution was incredibly successful in so many ways, but the story is definitely not over.
On one hand, that early focus on education and social reform has given Kerala some of the best social indicators in all of India, like super high literacy rates. But that success created new challenges, like high unemployment for all those educated people. A really powerful consumer culture has taken root. And, despite all the revolutionary work from the early reformers, a woman's identity is still often defined by who she marries and her family. The old battles were won, but new ones have definitely emerged.
The story of the Kerala Renaissance is this incredible reminder that you really can, change the world with a story. It proves that culture is never just entertainment. It's a battleground. It's the place where the future of a society is really decided. And that makes you wonder, doesn't it? What's the next frontier for change? And what are the stories that we need to be telling right now?